The morning the Mongols came, the sky itself seemed to burn. Villages that once whispered with laughter now screamed with fire. And for thousands, this was not the end, it was only the beginning of a nightmare that history tried to forget. It was the year 1220. The Mongol Empire had spread like a storm across Asia. Town after town vanished beneath their horses' hooves, and behind every conquest, an order was carried to take the land, break the men, capture the women. In the small city of Nishapur, a mother clutched her daughter's hand. Her name was Zarya, barely 17, her eyes wide with the kind of innocence war loves to destroy. The horizon shimmered with dust, not from the wind, but from thousands of galloping riders. The ground shook. Then came the horns. Every family that heard them knew the Mongols had arrived. Zarya's mother tried to hide her inside a storage pit, whispering, "Don't make a sound. Whatever happens, don't move." But silence could not stop an empire. The wooden door splintered. Soldiers poured in like shadows, armor blackened with soot and blood. They dragged women into the streets, marking them with ropes, separating them like cattle. For the Mongols, this was not chaos, it was procedure. Deep narration tone. Historians often speak of Genghis Khan's brilliance in warfare, his tactics, his speed, his strategy. But what few dare to describe is the machine he built behind those victories. A machine designed not just to conquer land, but to control bloodlines. Zarya was thrown among dozens of women, all bound, all trembling. Around them, smoke rose from burning homes. Children screamed for mothers who would never return. One Mongol officer walked through the rows of captives, his expression calm, almost administrative. He pointed. One woman was pulled aside, her childbearing years were over. A quick motion of the sword ended her life. Another was inspected, then nodded at. She was placed into a cart. This was selection. Efficient. Cold. Zarya was chosen. Her tears mixed with ash as they pushed her toward the wagons. Behind her, her mother's scream cut through the chaos, a single sound swallowed by the roar of fire. Reflective tone. That day, thousands of women disappeared across the Mongol frontier. But they were not killed. They were collected. It was the birth of something far darker than conquest, the beginning of an empire's hidden project. As the sun fell, the Mongols moved like a black tide into the desert, their wagons heavy with stolen lives. Zarya watched the horizon fade, knowing she would never see her home again. And in the silence of that night, one question began to echo across centuries. What kind of empire conquers not only nations, but the wounds of its enemies? They called them the rolling cages. But they were not cages for animals, they were for women. And as the wheels turned across the desert, a new kind of empire began to breathe, one that ruled not through fear of death, but through control of life itself. The Mongol caravan moved like a serpent through the dunes, long, unbroken, and filled with silent suffering. Inside each cage, iron bars rattled with the rhythm of hooves. Women from dozens of tribes sat pressed together, their faces bruised by the sun, their spirits cracked by the sound of chains. Each cage carried a mark, a small wooden board burned with a symbol. To the soldiers, it meant classification. To the captives, it meant fate. Some cages bore the sign of the crescent moon, for those who were young, untouched, and of pure blood. Others had the mark of the flame, women already married or with children, their value tied to experience. And the darkest mark of all, the broken circle, was for those considered infertile or resistant. Few who carried it survived the journey. Narration deepens. The Mongols were not only warriors, they were organizers. Every woman taken became a resource, every cage a ledger entry in a system more monstrous than the sword. Zarya sat among them, clutching a fragment of her torn dress, staring through the bars. The desert wind burned her skin, but what terrified her most was not the pain, it was the silence of those around her. They had stopped crying days ago. One of the guards, a young soldier, barely older than Zarya, walked beside the cage. He carried a long staff used to keep the prisoners still. But behind his blank eyes, even he seemed haunted. He whispered once, too quietly for others to hear. "Don't look back. The dead don't follow where you're going. Days turned to weeks. The cages rolled endlessly toward the Mongol heartlands, where the Khan's empire pulsed like a living machine. When one woman fell ill, the soldiers stopped the caravan. The door opened, she was dragged out, and a physician approached, not with compassion, but with calculation. He examined her eyes, her pulse, then nodded. A soldier struck her down. Her body was left for the vultures. To the Mongols, mercy was inefficiency. Reflective narration. The rolling cages were more than transport. They were filters, moving laboratories that decided who was fit to serve the empire's purpose. Those who survived the journey would become the foundation of what Mongol scribes later called the Lineage Project, a hidden program to reshape the blood of conquered nations. Zarya tried to sleep, but every night brought the same sound: the creak of wood, the rattle of iron, and the whispers of women praying to gods that had gone silent. Some whispered their children's names. Others whispered death wishes. She did neither. She whispered only one word, again and again. Remember. The caravan finally reached the Mongol stronghold near Samarkand, a city built on bones and gold. There, under the shadow of black banners, the cages stopped. One by one, the women were pulled out, numbered, and separated again, not as people, but as specimens. Their new home awaited them. The breeding fields, where the empire's most secret project would begin. They said the Mongols conquered half the world. But few speak of how they tried to conquer the future. Welcome to the breeding fields, where life was no longer born in love or hope, but in obedience. The air in the Mongol compound was thick with dust, smoke, and silence. Rows of tents stretched across the valley like scars on the earth. Guards patrolled between them, silent, efficient, watching. Here, women were not prisoners anymore. They were property. Each tent was a unit. Each woman, a number. Zarya's number was 47B. It was burned into a thin piece of wood that hung around her neck. Inside her tent, she sat with 10 others, women from Persia, Rus, China, and Khwarezm. They no longer spoke of home. Home was a ghost that could not be touched. Narration deepens. Every morning, Mongol physicians entered the camps with scrolls and tools. They were not healers, they were experimenters. They measured, recorded, and injected mixtures of herbs into women's arms. Some were meant to increase fertility, others to predict pregnancy. They called it progress. The women called it hell. Once a month, men chosen from Mongol ranks were brought in under heavy guard. The process was mechanical, there was no intimacy, no choice. When it was done, the physicians would write notes on parchment and move on to the next tent. And all the while, a clerk sat in a wooden booth, scratching numbers into a long ledger. Cycle complete. Subject 47B viable. Emotional narration, slow, heavy tone. Zarya watched it all like a ghost trapped inside her own body. She remembered her mother's last scream, the fire, the chaos, and now she was here, a piece in someone else's game. At night, she could hear women crying softly into the dirt. Some begged the sky for death. Others just stared at the stars, small lights of freedom they could never reach. Zarya whispered to them. Remember. If we forget, they win. Historical narration segment. Across the empire, reports from places like Samarkand, Balkh, and Bokhara described similar camps, secret, organized, and guarded by elite soldiers. Each one followed the same design. Outer wall for protection. Inner medical tent for recording outcomes. Storage for herbs and supplies. And the Crimson Pavilion, where Mongol nobles reviewed the records of reproductive success. This was not chaos. It was policy. The empire had learned that power could live in the body, not just in the sword. One night, Zarya was summoned to the physician's tent. He examined her carefully, muttering to his assistant. Strong heart. Regular pulse. High tolerance. He smiled, a thin, cruel line. Good. The Khan's project will favor you. Zarya didn't respond. But deep inside, something began to awaken, a small ember that refused to die. Reflective narration, rising tone. Every empire believes it can last forever. The Mongols thought control of blood could control destiny. But history is not written by records, it's written by those who survive them. Among the women, whispers began to spread. Whispers of rebellion, of poison, of escape. And at the center of those whispers was one word: Zarya. Empires fall by the sword. But some are built on ink. In the Mongol archives, life itself was written in ledgers and erased just as easily. Underscore 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 underscore. The tent of records stood in the center of the compound, a large structure covered in black hides and guarded day and night. Inside, hundreds of scrolls lined wooden racks. The smell of ink, oil, and dust filled the air. Here, women were not names. They were data. A single scribe, a man called Batar, oversaw it all. His hands were stained with ink, his eyes sunken from endless writing. Every morning, a line of assistants brought him parchments from the medical tents, lists of conception rates, health reports, and deaths. Batar's pen scratched like the ticking of a clock. Subject 24F, deceased. Cause, infection. Subject 47B, viable. Awaiting confirmation. Subject 12A, cycle incomplete. Each line was neat. Perfect. Lifeless. Underscore 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 underscore. Narration deepens. This was the heart of the empire's hidden system, the records of life. It was through these numbers that the Khan's scholars studied their experiment. They called it the future of empire. They believed if they could control birth, they could control destiny. Every tribe, every nation, every bloodline blended and balanced according to Mongol design. And yet, inside that perfection, small cracks began to form. Underscore 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 underscore. Zarya, now stronger and colder, had been reassigned to work as a cleaner inside the records tent. It was meant to be punishment for her defiance, but it became her window into the empire's secrets. Every night, when the scribes left, she swept the floors and watched the ledgers closely. She saw numbers that told stories. Whole pages suddenly crossed out, meaning death. Blank spaces where names should have been, meaning escape. And among the pages, she found something, a mark beside her own entry. 47B, exceptional vitality. Keep for the Khan's line. Her hands trembled as she read it. They weren't just breeding soldiers. They were creating dynasties. Underscore 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 underscore. Reflective tone, slow and haunting. That night, Zarya sat under the faint light of an oil lamp. Around her, the camp slept, exhausted, broken. But she could not sleep. The ink on those pages haunted her. Every stroke of a quill decided who lived, who died, who mattered. And yet, the Mongols had made one mistake. They believed records gave them control. But records could also be rewritten. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, when the guards brought new scrolls, Zarya worked as usual. But each time she passed the shelves, she made small changes, a number here, a mark there. A deceased became missing. A missing became escaped. Every altered word planted confusion, every change slowed the machine. Weeks later, the clerks began to argue. The tallies don't match. How can 43 subjects vanish from 2/10? Zarya kept sweeping, her face calm, her heart pounding. Behind her silence, rebellion had begun, not with fire or steel, but with ink. Underscore 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 underscore. Narration builds, emotional crescendo. Across the camp, women noticed fewer inspections. Guards grew uncertain. One night, a cart filled with scrolls caught fire, no one knew how. Batar screamed, trying to save the ledgers as flames devoured them. But the fire spread fast, licking up the parchment like dry grass. For the first time in months, the women looked up, not in fear, but in hope. Amid the chaos, Zarya whispered again. Remember. Sometimes, the loudest act of rebellion is silence. And in that silence, empires tremble. Underscore 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 underscore. The camp no longer hummed with order. The perfect rhythm of the Mongol machine had begun to fracture. The air smelled of burnt parchment and fear. The guards whispered. The scribes looked over their shoulders. And in the middle of it all, Zarya worked quietly, her eyes sharp, her heart steady. Days after the fire, soldiers arrived to restore control. New overseers were brought in. They demanded answers. Who started the fire? Who changed the records? But no one spoke. The women had learned silence from Zarya, and now, that silence was stronger than any sword. Underscore 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 underscore. Inside the commander's tent, Batar, the ink-stained scribe, kneeled before his superior. He begged for mercy, swearing he had done nothing wrong. But the commander's hand struck him hard. You failed to protect the Khan's property. Outside, the women listened as Batar's cries faded into the cold air. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, Zarya walked past the smoking remains of the archive tent. Ashes drifted like black snow. Every paper, every number gone. In their place, the wind carried only whispers. We are not numbers, she murmured. We are not yours. underscore 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 underscore. Narration deepens, emotional focus. Weeks passed. The Mongols prepared to move the surviving captives east toward Karakoram, the empire's heart. Rumors spread that Genghis Khan himself would choose from among them. Fear returned like winter frost. But Zarya had changed. She no longer felt like the frightened girl who had been dragged from her village. She had seen the inside of the empire and she had wounded it from within. And that knowledge was freedom. Underscore 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 underscore. As the caravan began its march, she walked beside other women, some weak, some broken, but all clinging to one another. Among them were those she had secretly marked escaped in the records. To the Mongols, they no longer existed. To the world, they were ghosts. And ghosts could move unseen. Underscore 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 underscore. Tension builds, slow and cinematic. For days they traveled through open plains and mountains, chained but watching. One night, when the guards grew drunk, Zarya spoke softly to the others. "Tonight, we vanish for real." In the silence of the steppe, they moved like shadows. Chains cut with stolen knives. Bare feet against frozen grass. Breath held. A few were caught, their screams echoed in the dark, but most escaped into the wilderness. Zarya ran until her lungs burned. The stars above looked endless, cold, and merciless, but free. Underscore 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 underscore. Resolution, poetic and powerful. Months later, stories began to spread through the conquered lands. Of women who had escaped the Mongol camps. Of ledgers burned. Of a nameless girl who turned the empire's order into chaos. The Mongols denied it, of course. To them, the system had never existed. But the silence of the survivors said otherwise. Underscore 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 underscore.